And welcome back to Dear Disney Presents Walt Disney, an American original. Today we are going to be doing Section 3, Chapter 12. And before we get going, if you're enjoying hearing me read this wonderful book, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Chapter 12. The 2 million drawings that made up Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs had been combined to produce 83 minutes of superlative motion picture. Critics were unanimously enthusiastic. Audience were enthralled. All attendance records were broken in an unprecedented 3-week run at the Radio City Music Hall. The attraction could have run longer, but the Disney brothers believed it should play the New York neighborhoods while the public interest was still high. The Seven Dwarfs, especially Dopey, became immediate folk figures, and the film's songs, particularly Hi Ho, It's Off the Work We Go, and Whistle While You Work, were heard from every radio. Walt and Roy Disney enjoyed the unique experience of watching money pour into their corporation. Within 6 months after the release of Snow White, they had paid off all of their bank loans. The $8 million that the film earned in its first release was a phenomenal sum, considering that the average price for theater admission in the United States in 1938 was 23 cents. And a heavy percentage of those seeing Snow White were children admitted for a dime. Walt was euphoric. To see Disney's folly turned out so magnificently well was dreamlike. The experience erased all the bitter happenings of his early career. The bankruptcy of Laugh-O-Grams, the loss of Oswald, the defections of the animators he had brought into the business, the chicanery of Pat Powers. He was enormously proud of his artists. They had worked long hours at salaries that were modestly compared to similar work in other industries, although higher than those paid in other cartoon studios. Some of the Disney animators were so eager for Snow White to succeed that they tacked up advertising posters on fences and telephone poles when the movie opened in Los Angeles. The Disneys had instituted a system of bonus payments to employees when the studio fortunes were prospering, and with the Snow White success, surprise amounts appeared in paychecks. Walt also wanted a dramatic way to show his appreciation for his workers' efforts, and he announced a festive weekend for the entire studio staff at the Lake Norconian Resort, east of Los Angeles. It was a mistake. The latent bohemianism of the Disney artists sprang forth full bloom. Legends of the riotous happenings were repeated for years. The event was not. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs indicated the direction in which the Disney organization had to go. Short cartoons would continue to be the staple product, providing a steady income and permitting Walt to train new animators and develop fresh techniques. But the shorts were sold to theaters in blocks, and even the exceptionally good ones earned very little more than average cartoons. Walt sometimes mused over how much more money Three Little Pigs might have amassed if it had been feature length. Features had to become the creative thrust of the studio. Walt realized the company could expand only by producing full length movies to compete for theater rentals with the top flight attractions of the major studios. He began devoting his major attention to features, paying less heed to the shorts. Thus began the pattern of creative life. As he discovered each new, unexplored medium, his interest dwindled in the one that he had previously conquered. Again, Walt pressed for expansion. He hired more and more artists, looking ahead to the time when the studio would be producing several cartoon features simultaneously. Obviously, the Hyperion Avenue plant could no longer accommodate his ambitious program. It had grown chaotically, spilling to adjoining lots and across the street. In 1937 and early 1938, the studio had added a feature building, 3 film vaults, part of a soundstage, test camera bungalow, camera building, projection booth, electric shop, sound shop, paint lab, and inking buildings, as well as several nearby bungalows which were used for various purposes. Air conditioning was non existent, and working on cells had to be suspended during the summer's hottest days because the artist's sweat dripped on the ink and paint. Walt and Roy agreed that they needed to build a new studio. They found 51 acres for sale on Buena Vista Street in Burbank, just over the hills of Griffith Park. On August 31st, 1938, they put a deposit of $10,000 on the property, the purchase price to be $100,000. Walt and Lily now had a second daughter, Sharon May, born on New Year's Eve, 1936. The Disneys did some entertaining at home, mostly for relatives and close friends at the studio. Walt and Lily went to the studio at night to play badminton with other husbands and wives. Although Walt was now accepted as one of Hollywood's most successful and creative filmmakers, he rarely mingled with Hollywood society. He went each year to the Academy Awards banquet and usually came home with an Oscar. For Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, he received a special one, consisting of one full size and seven dwarf Oscars mounted in a stair step arrangement. Such appearances before his peers caused an uncommon lack of ease. The 10-year-old Shirley Temple, noticing his demeanor when she presented him with the Snow White Oscars, commented, "Don't be nervous, Mr. Disney." The Oscars brought new fame to Walt Disney, and he found himself being recognized when he appeared in public. He was not entirely pleased. "I never have time to ponder over the fact that I may be what they call a celebrity," he wrote in response to an inquiry from Arnold Herman of Elmhurst College, Illinois. "And if I'm one, it was never helped me make a better picture, nor has it ever bettered my polo game, which I certainly wish it would. Here's one when Here's once when it happened, though. It did get me a good seat to one of the football games this winter. But then what about the mob that pounced on me for autographs after the game? No, being a celebrity does not mean so much." Walt had to give up polo. Roy had urged him to do so, arguing that the man on whom their enterprise relied for its creative direction should not risk his health in such a dangerous sport. Walt resisted until he played in two matches in which horsemen suffered fatal injuries. Then he himself was involved in an accident and crushed four of his cervical vertebrae. The injury might have healed if he had been placed in a cast, but he consulted a chiropractor who manipulated the broken bones and contributed to an arthritic condition that pained Walt Disney until the end of his life. Both Walt and Roy became increasingly concerned about their parents, who were living in Portland, and despite the advance of their years, were working as hard on the small apartment houses they owned as they had on the Marceline farm. When Flora Disney's health broke down, Roy flew to Portland to convince his parents that they could no longer exert themselves. Walt wrote his mother, "We have been worried for some time for fear you and Dad have been attempting too much and jeopardizing your health. I was glad that Roy was able to sit down and talk things over with you and reason things out. I think you should keep in mind that your health is worth far more than any money that might be derived by trying to do too much with your own hands. After all, money is no good to you if we do not have good health to enjoy it. I would a lot rather be poor and healthy than rich and have ill health. Anyway, I want you to know that we have been praying and hoping that everything would turn out for the best, and it is a big relief to us to know that you are getting along so well, and I hope Dad will listen to reason and stop doing the heavy work that has been doing. It might lead to complications with his rupture. I can't understand why he won't take things easier and behave himself. It may be that the trouble you had will be a warning to him." The elder Disneys continued to live in Portland until 1938, when Roy and Walt convinced their parents that the Southern California climate would be better for them. The sons paid $8,300 for a comfortable bungalow in North Hollywood, a short distance from the house of Roy and Edna and their son Roy Edward, who was then 8 years old. New Year's Day of 1938 was a joyous celebration for the whole Disney family. It was the golden wedding anniversary of Flora and Elias. All of their sons gathered for the event. Herb now lived in Los Angeles with his wife and daughter. He still worked for the post office. Ray had moved west from Kansas City and was running an insurance business. Ruth remained in Portland, where she had married Theodore Beecher and had a son. At the anniversary celebration, Walt recorded a mock interview with his parents, and it demonstrated the raillery within the family. Walt: "Well, you folks are almost ready to celebrate your 50th wedding anniversary." Flora: "We're not going to celebrate." Walt: "Why not?" Flora: "Oh, what's the use?" Walt: "Well, Dad likes to celebrate. He always enjoyed a good time." Flora: "We've been celebrating for 50 years, getting tired of it." Walt: "What about you, Dad? Don't you want to make a whoopee on your golden wedding anniversary?" Elias: "Oh, we don't want to go to any extremes at all." Walt: "Well, I hope you wouldn't go to any extremes if you're whoopieing it up." Flora: "He don't know how to make whoopee." Walt: "Mother, how was it to live with a guy for 50 years? That's an awful long time." Flora: "Well, it was a long time, but..." Walt: "I think it was kind of ornery at times, wasn't he, huh?" Flora. Sure, he was ornery. You know a little bit about that yourself, don't you? Do you remember that time you painted the whole side of the house when we went to town? Walt. Me? Flora and Alice. Yes, you. Walt. Oh, that was Roy or somebody. I wouldn't do a thing like that. Flora. No, it was you. Walt. Well, it must have been Roy, because I couldn't think of myself doing a thing like that. Home movies of the Disney family were taken during the 1930s, and they afford a revealing portrait of the elder Disneys in their late years. Flora Disney appears better looking than in still photographs, which accent the deep hollow eyes. She has a twinkle in the movies, especially when she's teased by Walt. Elias seems different too, not the somber person of the photographs, posing for the cameraman on a lawn swing. He tries to force a kiss on Flora, but she objects and places a pillow between them. He seems unmarked by his lifetime of disappointments. Indeed, he retained his socialist idealism to the end of his life. Walt, who had supported Franklin Roosevelt but was growing more conservative, once asked, Dad, how do you feel about having voted 50 years for candidates who never won anything? Walter, I feel fine, Elias replied. We have won. We've won a lot. I found out that things don't always come about in the form you have advocated, but you keep fighting and they come about in some way or another. Today, everything I fought for in those early days have been absorbed into the platforms of both major parties. Now I feel pretty good about that. Elias Disney was in his 70s when he discovered that he had been voting illegally all his life. His voting status was changed, and it was discovered that he was an alien in the eyes of the law. When the family had moved from Canada to Kansas, his father had taken out naturalization papers. When he achieved his citizenship, his minor children became citizens too. But Elias had come of age before the process had been completed, and he remained a Canadian citizen. Although born in Ohio, Flora Disney was also an alien because of marriage. I raised my family here. This country has been good to me, Elias announced. I'm going to die an American citizen. And so he and Flora spent long hours restudying the Constitution and American history for their citizenship examinations. When they appeared in court, the judge remarked, Mr. Disney, you won't have to go through this, and Elias and Flora were declared naturalized. The elder Disneys had been in their new home less than a month when tragedy struck. A defective furnace caused Flora's death by asphyxiation on the night of November 26, 1938. Walt and Roy were devastated, blaming themselves because their mother's death had been happened in the house they had bought. Walt was sensitive about the tragedy and to the end of his life. 20 years later, one of his secretaries casually mentioned his mother's death. I don't want that ever brought up in this office again, Walt said sternly, and he hurried out of the room. The cry of distributors and exhibitors were after Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was the same that greeted the hit of Three Little Pigs. More pigs! Now the movie man implored, Give us more dwarves! Walt Disney refused to repeat himself. He embarked on 3 new animation features that were totally different in content and style. Pinocchio came first, the picaresque tale written by Carlo Lorenzini under the pen name of Carlo Collodi in 1880 seemed like an ideal subject for a feature cartoon. And Walt pursued the new project almost demonically. He was determined to make it even greater than Snow White. During a story meeting on March 15th, 1938, he was exploding with ideas for the sequence in which Pinocchio was swallowed by the whale. Pinocchio should use every ounce of force he has in his swimming to escape the whale. This should be built to terrific suspense. It should be the equivalent of the storm and the chase of the Queen and Snow White. The old man, Geppetto, already swallowed by the whale, should get excited when the whale starts after the fish. When the fish starts coming in, he could look towards the whale's mouth and say, Tuna! Pinocchio could be swimming with a fish, and the whale swallows them all. As the old man is fishing inside the whale, he pulls out one fish after another, and finally pulls out Pinocchio without realizing it. The cat sees Pinocchio, gets excited, and meows at the old man, but the old man goes right on fishing. Finally, Pinocchio calls, Father! The old man realizes who it is and shouts, Pinocchio, my son! We can get comedy out of the whale sneezing with Pinocchio and Geppetto inside. They should react in a certain way. It would be the equivalent to the hiccups in the giant's mouth. The whale would quiver before the sneeze and shake them around, throw them off their feet into the floor. They'd be shouting over the noise of the whale. When he sneezed, it would slosh the water all around and up on the sides, and it would drop down in Geppetto and Pinocchio like a shower. The sneeze stirs the water up so when they escape, the water's already rough and stormy. They get ready and the sneeze blows them out. Then, as the whale comes into another sneeze and the inhale starts drawing them back, they have to paddle hard against it. The underwater stuff is a swell place for the multiplane, diffusing and putting haze in between, with shafts of light coming down. I like to see a lot of multiplane on this. Because of what Walt and his staff had learned on Snow White, they should have an easier time with Pinocchio. But they didn't. The story had splendid elements of adventure, but Pinocchio lacked the appealing characters of Snow White. Pinocchio himself was a nettling problem. He was a puppet come to life, and he could not be animated as a normal boy would be. His moves had to be simple and unsophisticated, as though he had known no previous history. His face was expressionless, and he lacked the boyish qualities that could make such a character engaging. After 6 months, Walt called a halt in production. He realized that new elements had to be added before Pinocchio could come to life. The answer was to surround Pinocchio with intriguing, flamboyant characters. The most important was Jiminy Cricket. In the book, the cricket had played a brief role as an admonisher of the errant puppet, only to be rewarded by being crushed under Pinocchio's foot. For the film, the cricket was installed as the boy's conscience, trying to guide him away from evil companions and the pitfalls of pleasure seeking. But how could an ugly insect be converted into a likable character? And how could he be large enough to play in scenes with human figures? Several artists attempted concepts of the cricket, complete with antenna. Walt rejected them all. He sent for one of the younger animators, Ward Kimball. When Kimball entered the boss's office, he had every intention of resigning. His work for Snow White had been on the bed building and soup eating scenes, and both had been cut from the final versions. Kimball tried to express his despair, but Walt started one of his spellbinding narratives, describing the adventures of Pinocchio in his voice of conscience, Jiminy Cricket. By the end of the recital, Kimball had forgotten his resolve to quit. He accepted Walt's assignment to produce a workable cricket, and Kimball's Jiminy was appealing and uncricket-like. The problem of size was resolved by skillful use of camera angles. Jiminy Cricket's success was assured with the addition of two hit songs for him to sing, When You Wish Upon a Star and Give a Little Whistle. They were composed by Lee Harline with lyrics by Ned Washington and sung by Cliff Edwards. The stick-like figure of Pinocchio became more rounded and boy-like, and he was presented as a boy who was easily swayed by bad influences, rather than a determined delinquent. The interplay between him and Jiminy worked perfectly, although no one ever solved the fundamental problem of a hero with no will of his own. Pinocchio was literally a puppet who was alternately drawn between good and evil. Hence, he could never match the human appeal of Snow White. With Pinocchio at last on the right track, Walt ordered the film into full production, and his staff shared Walt's resolve to make the second feature greater than the first. If anything, there was an overabundance of zeal, with the directorial units competing to make their sequences the most important and effective in the movie. Walt had to maintain control lest Pinocchio end up 3 times its desired length. He indulged his artists in the use of special effects and the multiplane camera for visual images that far exceeded those of Snow White. The results were highly effective artistically and expensive. When Pinocchio was finally completed, it had cost a stunning $2.6 million. Fantasia came into being because of Walt Disney's concern for the career of Mickey Mouse. Walt retained his almost mystical attachment to Mickey. To him, the mouse was not merely a revenue producing cartoon character, nor even a good luck talisman. Walt was Mickey's voice, his alter ego, and it troubled Walt to see that Mickey Mouse's career declined. It had been inevitable. Mickey had been an international attraction for a decade, and few movie stars could sustain their career for that long a time. In the beginning, Mickey Mouse could do anything. He was drawn with a series of circles of varying sizes, and he moved with what animators called the rubber hose technique, action with little relation to human or animal movement. As cartoons became more sophisticated, so did Mickey. Freddie Moore was the first to apply the squash and stretch technique to the animation of Mickey, making him more human and appealing. Moore gave the face more character and definition. For the first time, Mickey had a cheek when his teeth went together. Even with a more pliable face and figure, Mickey presented problems. He was cuter, but he lacked the primitive vitality of the early cartoons. With his shy manner, he was essentially a latent character, not the instigator of comic happenings. That function befell the broader characters who supported Mickey in the cartoons. Inevitably, they became stars of their own series. Donald Duck and Pluto in 1937, Goofy in 1939. The size of all three made them easy to work with. Donald was the height of a duck, and Pluto and Goofy could be portrayed dog size. But the Mickey story men and animators were facing was the recurrent problem. What can you do with a 4-foot mouse? In 1938, Walt decided to star Mickey Mouse in a cartoon presentation of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, an old fairy tale which had been interpreted as a poem by Goethe and a concert piece by the French composer Paul Dukas. Paul Dukas. Mickey was cast as the apprentice whose misuse of the sorcerer's powers wreaks disaster. The entire action would be done in a pantomime to the Dukas music. Walt seemed pleased that no dialogue would be required. He suspected that Mickey, Walt's hesitant falsetto, contributed to the character's difficulty in playing varied roles. Walt planned to release The Sorcerer's Apprentice as a two-reeler, but that changed after a chance meeting with Leopold Stokowski, the distinguished conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. During a conversation at a party, Walt mentioned that he was starring Mickey Mouse in The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Stokowski, a devoted follower of the Disney cartoons, volunteered to conduct the Dukas music for Walt. Stokowski visited the studio and was overwhelmed by everything he saw. He was especially fascinated with the recording of sound and the ability of technicians to alter and combine various tracks of music. When Stokowski began the score, he recorded each section at a time: woodwinds, brass, percussion, etc. He spent hours at the mixing board, combining the sections in varying degrees of volume. "This is the ultimate in conducting," he said, delighted. Stokowski suggested other musical works which could be interpreted in animation. Walt listened to the recordings and his imagination soared. He announced that The Sorcerer's Apprentice would not be released as a two-reeler, would be part of a full-length film that would feature other works of serious music as well. The new project was given the working title of the concert feature. One of Stokowski's suggestions was the Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Bach. Walt did some reading about Bach and discovered that the composer had been a church organist who had often improvised his works in flights of creativity. Why not illustrate the toccata and fugue, he suggested, in the same free manner? He tested his theory by listening to the Bach composition again and again, and he and Stokowski discussed their reactions. A loud crescendo seemed to Walt like coming out of a dark tunnel and with a big splash of light coming in on you. A passage suggested orange to Walt. "Oh no, I see it as purple," said Stokowski. A woodwind portion gave Walt the image of a hot kettle with spaghetti floating in it. Walt was amused later when highbrow critics professed to see profundities in the abstractions created for the toccata and fugue. He wasn't aiming at anything highbrow, nor was he trying to bring classical music to the mass audience. He was simply trying to use serious music as another tool for animation. Always he stressed the visual. "I remember when I used to go to a concert when I was a kid," he told his artist. "I could see the orchestra tuning up and then the conductor coming out and starting the music and the violin bows going up and down in unison." It had been a visual experience for him, the images of the players on the stage and the mental pictures that the music had inspired. In most cases, the music for the concert feature was selected first, and the visual image applied afterwards. For one sequence, it was the reverse. Walt wanted to depict the creation and evolution of Earth. He instructed Dick Humer to find a suitable piece of music. Humer had been assigned to the concert feature because his taste for classical music. Walt often introduced him. "Meet Dick, work called Creation," and Walt explained his problem to Stokowski. "Why don't we do the sacre?" the conductor exclaimed. "Soccer? What's that?" Walt asked. "Sacre de Printemps, Rite of Spring, by Stravinsky," said Stokowski. He told how Stravinsky had depicted the primitive peoples of the Russian steppes with weird dissonances. The music could easily portray the Earth's paroxysms during its birth and early history, Stokowski declared. Walt listened to a recording of the composition and he immediately agreed. Walt hired Deems Taylor, the noted music commentator, to advise on the concert feature and later to perform the narration. Like Stokowski, Taylor was enchanted by the inner workings of the Disney studio. One day, when Walt complained that sometimes he believed his artist had never grown up, Taylor replied, "How can you grow up in this atmosphere, for God's sakes? It's like living in Santa Claus's workshop." Taylor and Stokowski joined Walt in his story personnel and conferences about the selection and treatment of the music. On September 30th, 1938, they were discussing the Arcadian sequence to accompany Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony in the film. Stokowski: "In listening to this music, it seems to come in three large masses. The first is the fawn school, and so forth. The second is the little feminine one. The third is very excited, where something is all jumbled up together. That's the general plan of the music, if you keep it in three big masses." Walt: "There's a theme that comes in with the dancing, the flute, then the dancing lesson, then the beauty, or love, or water and swimming, and then comes what I call the chase excitement. It really is four." Stokowski: "I think beauty, love, excitement is part of the chase. It's in the music and part of the chase. So it's the flute playing, the fawns dancing with or around the girls, and the excitement." Walt: "There would be a lot of comedy in that chase if you had a group of little fawns. It would be better than only one, because he would be awfully busy. You would have an awful lot to show. You could show two or three little guys trying to bulldog him and everything. You can accomplish more with half a dozen." Taylor: "If Oscar sneaked up on the sleeping Pegasus on the ground, and it went up in the air with him on his back." Walt: "Yes, he might sneak up on what he thinks is the rear end of a horse, lasso it, and it flies up, and here's Oscar hanging on to it, and it dumps him in the pool. The whole last end of 4 minutes can be full of life. If we get stuck, we can ignore that part that's supposed to be love. The flying horses come down, maybe to help the girls, and it flies down like a hummingbird. It can fly around and kick in the air while still flying." Taylor: "Show Oscar terrified, going up and up and up, and he sees what's down below, something that is a reproduction of Greece in the history books." Walt felt dissatisfied that the playback of recordings could not duplicate the full, rich orchestral sound he heard in the recording studio. He assigned his sound department to develop a new system of multi-aural sound which could reproduce the actual performance in a concert hall, and then some. For Schubert's Ave Maria, he wanted the voices of the choristers to sound as if they were in the procession down the aisle of the theater. The result of the research was Fantasound, which recorded music with several microphones and reproduced it on an equal number of loudspeakers, creating a stereophonic effect. To get the best possible quality, Walt had Stokowski record the entire score at the Philadelphia Academy of Music, which was noted for its superb acoustics. The music bill alone for Fantasia amounted to more than $400,000, and when the long production ended, the total cost was $2.28 million. The third project Walt Disney chose to follow Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was Bambi. Although it was started at the same time as the other two, it was the last to be released. The Felix Salten book of a deer's coming of age in the forest provided a natural vehicle for a cartoon feature. Only through animation could the story be adequately told. But Bambi was different from anything Disney had ever attempted. It was far more serious than Snow White and Pinocchio, and the characters were all animals. Walt realized that to carry such a storyline, his animators would need to create characters that were realistic. The deer would have to be deer like, the rabbits rabbit like. Could his artists meet such a challenge and still create a film that would be entertaining? He determined to give them all the tools they needed. He hired a noted painter of animals, Rico Lebrun, to lecture on the structure of animals and how they moved. He sent a cameraman, Maurice Day, to Maine to photograph thousands of feet of forest, snowfall, rainstorms, spider webs, changes of light and seasons. The Maine Development Commission provided 2 live fawns for the Disney studio, and they were sketched and photographed as they grew. Rabbits, ducks, skunks, owls, and other species were added until the studio resembled a small zoo. A local naturalist contributed hundreds of photographs of animals in action. During one of the first story conferences on Bambi, Walt outlined some of his ideas for the production. "When it comes to the animation, we can do a lot with the rabbit. He has a certain mannerism that can be drawn. We might get him to twitch his nose. I don't like to have us get off the track too much to show his life. Everything should be done through Bambi. The owl ought to be a stupid, silly thing. He is always trying to scare people. I like his crazy screech as it's described in the book. He might be a sort of Hugh Herbert, an eccentric movie comic type. I would hate to see any of the characters too straight. You would want them that in Bambi's mother. You would want Bambi more or less straight in a way. The comedy would come from him as a kid through his questions and his curiosity. The rest of the characters I would like to see come out of life. I would like the old stag to say what he has to say in a direct way, and in such a voice that Bambi is unable to answer him. What he says will be sort of final. That can be put over through the voice. I like Feline's character in the book. She's clever and she understands things. Bambi asks a lot of questions which she can answer. If we build her that way, we will be able to get a lot of stuff over when she and Bambi get together. Let us start moving on the thing and not drag it out too long. After we get our characters set, we should write all our business for the characters and build the first half. Then we should record it and get our sketches. We will shoot the sketches and make it a music track, all of which will make our story pretty tight. Our soundtrack will be a dummy track composed of a cello, a violin, a piano, and an organ, which will be enough to give us an idea of the music. When we do that, we'll have a chance to review the thing before we go into layout and animation. That would include the first part of the picture, up to the end of the first winter. Walt tried to push ahead in a deliberate way, but Bambi simply would not be managed. Once again, he and his artists were pioneering. Even such a matter as the spots on the fawn's skin provided complication. The best of animators had to spend 45 minutes on each drawing. Daily output would be 8 drawings, half a foot of film, compared to a normal rate of 10 feet per day. Less experienced animators required an hour and a half to draw the fawn. The storyline continued to present problems, and Walt realized that he could not maintain the same production pace as with Pinocchio and Fantasia. He formed a small unit of young animators, Frank Thomas, Milt Kahl, Eric Larson, and Ollie Johnston, to concentrate on Bambi. Don't show me anything until you're satisfied with it, Walt instructed. Thomas went to work on the scene in which a butterfly lands on the tail of the young Bambi. Kahl drew a sequence of the fawn leaping over a log and falling in a tangle on top of Thumper. When the rough animation on both scenes was completed, Walt saw the result in a sweatbox. Tears filled his eyes. Fellas, this is pure gold, he remarked to Thomas and Kahl. He had at last seen what he wanted Bambi to be. With 3 features in the regular program of shorts in production, the Hyperion studio was filled to overflowing. The Bambi unit moved to a rented building at 861 North Seward Street in Hollywood. The story, research, promotion, engineering, comic strip, and training departments occupied the second floor of a building at 1717 North Vine Street. Walt was anxiously looking forward to the time when he could have all the studio departments at the new headquarters in Burbank. Planning the new studio was a fresh and immensely stimulating experience for Walt. For a dozen years, he had endured the chaotically makeshift studio on Hyperion Avenue, where animators worked in cluttered, poorly lighted rooms through the chill of winter and the summer's heat. He was determined to build a new studio where he and his fellow workers could create an atmosphere of comfort and congeniality. Walt involved himself with every aspect of planning, conferring with architects, draftsmen, furniture designers, interior decorators, landscapers, acoustic experts, carpenters, and plumbers. One day, Otto Englander burst into Walt's office with an idea for ending the first movement of the Pastoral Symphony in Fantasia. Englander found Walt seated on the floor of his office amid a clutter of chromium tubes and blue leatherette cushions. Walt explained sheepishly that he was considering a new design for an animator's chair, and he was taking it apart to see how it was constructed. Walt listened as Englander explained his idea. Having 2 cupids draw a curtain before the audience, approved it, and returned to his dissection of the chair. The new studio, Walt insisted, would need to be big enough to accommodate his maximum production. That meant the regular program of 18 to 20 short cartoons, plus the features. If he released 1 feature a year, he would need facilities for 3 features, since they seemed to require 3 years to produce. If he increased his output to 2 a year, then 6 features would be in production at one time. The center of the production process would be the animation building, where the various phases of animation could flow smoothly from one to the other in a movie-making assembly line. It would house the story department, directors, layout men, animators, assistant animators, and in-betweeners. When the animation had been completed, the work would move through an underground tunnel to the inking and painting building, then to the camera building, and beyond to the cutting building. Three stages would be built, one for recording music, the other two for dialogue and sound effects. There would also be a theater, a process laboratory for experimenting with film methods, and a restaurant. A key element to the planning was air conditioning. At the Hyperion Avenue studios, Walt had often grumbled because dust on cells and lenses interfered with production. Variation in humidity was also a problem since the water paints cracked and chipped off the celluloid in dry weather and smeared when it was humid. Walt also realized that the summer weather was much hotter in the San Fernando Valley, and he wanted his employees to work in comfort the year around. Walt invited engineers of General Electric to confer with architects and structural engineers during the planning stages, rather than try to install air conditioning after the building had been erected. A system was devised to pipe fresh, cool air to every office. But what if someone opens a window? They'll destroy the whole system, Walt reasoned. The solution: remove the window cranks. The extent of the planning presaged Disneyland in Walt Disney World. Water for the air conditioning system, as well as the process laboratory, lawn sprinkling, toilets, and other uses, came from two wells sunk 300 feet into the earth. Not only were the major buildings connected by tunnels, the utilities were placed underground as well. The studio would become a miniature city with its own streets, storm drains, sewage systems, fire hydrants, telephone exchange, and electric distribution systems. The size of the streets, conduits, and pipes were all calculated to provide for future expansion without interfering with studio production. Walt lavished his most concentrated planning on the animation building. It was designed as a three-story structure with eight wings connected to a central corridor. The wings would be on a true east west axis, each office with an outside view. The plan provided a maximum of rooms with north light. Those facing the sun would be shielded with Venetian blinds that could be adjusted to lessen the glare. Because Burbank was close to Earth faults, the building would be constructed in 10 separate units which would move independently in case of an earthquake. Everything was designed for the comfort of the Disney animators. Each piece of furniture was planned to combine function with graceful modern appearance. The animation desks was redesigned to eliminate waste time and motion. The carpets and drapes in harmonizing pastel colors would help provide a restful, quiet atmosphere. The sweatbox would be abolished, although the cognomen remained. Animators would be able to review their work in a comfortable projection rooms. Walt aimed to make the Burbank studio a worker's paradise. The buildings would be surrounded by broad lawns, where the employees could play baseball, badminton, and volleyball during their lunch hours. They would be able to eat in a modern restaurant where the appetizing meals would be served at prices below the studio's costs. If an animator felt the need for a malted milk or a cup of coffee during the day, he would need only to call the snack shop on the first floor and it would be delivered to him. The penthouse of the animation building would be the equivalent of a gentleman's club, where the animators and executives could make use of a lounge, soda fountain, sun deck, gymnasium, and showers. Except for after-work parties, no liquor was served. Walt himself never drank until after the workday was over, and he disapproved of those who took long lunch breaks at nearby bars. Walt and Roy asked their father to supervise the carpentry in the building of the new studio, hoping the work would help alleviate the despondency he had felt since the death of Flora. Although he was 80, Elias Disney donned work clothes and spent a full day overseeing the carpenters and pounding nails themselves. As he watched the construction grow, he expressed his concern to the youngest son. Walter, how on earth are you going to support this big place with those cartoons of yours? Aren't you afraid you'll go broke? Walt replied. If I do fail, Dad, I can get out easy. You notice how this place is built with rooms along long corridors. If I go broke with my cartoons, I could always sell it for a hospital. Elias Disney was greatly relieved by the explanation. Walt followed each phase of the planning and drove to the Burbank property almost every day during the excavation and construction. With his studio operation now scattered from Hyperion to Hollywood, he was anxious to have the new studio completed. The camera building was finished first, and the filming began there on Pinocchio in August of 1939. When the lease on the Seward property ran out in the fall, the Bambi unit occupied part of the uncompleted animation building. On the day after Christmas, the major part of the studio began the move from Hyperion to Burbank. A few of the departments followed in the spring. For his own office, Walt chose a suite on the third floor in the far northeast corner of the animation building. The suite contained an outer office, an office for his secretary, Dolores Vaught, Walt's own spacious office, a conference room, and a room where he could sleep if he had to remain overnight at the studio. Such an occasion arose a month after he had moved into the new studio. He later related his experience. I was all set to go to sleep about 10:30 when all of a sudden the air conditioning shut off for the night. Woohoo! It was like submerging in a submarine. There's plenty of air in the room, but I had this feeling that I was going to suffocate. I yelled, but there was nobody around. I ran over to the window and clawed and scratched, trying to get it open. All I did was cut my fingers. Me, the guy who told them to take all the handles off the windows. I finally had to break the window so I could breathe. Walt was a character, wasn't he? Well, that ends today's chapter. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And remember, today's special moments are tomorrow's memories. Have a wonderful day.